Bradherley no Basha. Man, alright. So Bradherley no Basha, made by the author of Blade of the Immortal fame, Samuro Hideaki, is real depressing if I were to undersell it majorly. Bradherley no Basha is a manga that has found its way on a number of most effed up things I've ever read list, and I'd be absolutely lying if I said I couldn't see why. It's a pretty damn nihilistic tale if I've ever read one, but for my mileage, there's a significant story being told here. I've seen on a number of forums individuals blasting Bradherley's coach as shock value simply for the sake of it, stating that the story was only made to see how extreme of a reaction it could elicit from anyone unlucky enough to have found themselves reading it. Well, I completely disagree with this sentiment, however, and feel that there's both artistic merit and emotional weight to be found for those who have the ability to handle the subject matter being presented. And I won't lie to you, man, the stuff that's in this manga is certainly not going to be for everybody. Definitely not for the faint of heart. If it's too much, don't feel bad about it. Don't be down on yourself about it. It really is a lot. So without further ado, let's kind of dive in. So in order to get deeper into what I feel like makes Bradherley no Basha a worthwhile story, I need to give a brief summary of what the story is about. So every year, resident piece of abject filth, Lord Nicola A. Bradherley, who you will soon know why I call him this, Bradherley is one of Europe's most renowned aristocrats, and he goes to various orphanages throughout the land and adopts young girls to train for his opera troupe. What a guy, right? Going around random villages, making the dreams of random young girls come true who may otherwise have never been given the opportunity. Well, this is where Bradherley no Basha garners its reputation, and the story takes a turn for the supremely tragic. See, only some of the girls taken on stagecoaches are actually given the opportunity to become troupe members. The other girls are unwittingly made into fodder for government program seeking to quell dissent and riots in the prisons. See, the wealthy statesmen decided that prisoners in their local facilities were getting much too rowdy and dangerous, so they needed something to keep these men in line. What was decided on was Bradherley would partner with the state to gather young girls from the orphanages he was familiar with, because it's much less of a fuss if a number of orphans go missing rather than your quote-unquote average child, right? Rather than have them join the theater, these girls would instead become what has colloquially been dubbed as Pascal's lambs. Alright, now before we continue, quick history lesson. Pascal was a famous 17th century philosopher, arguably most famous for presenting Pascal's wager, which in the most quick and primitive way I could put it, states that the belief in God is rational because if one believes in God and God is real, they gain infinite rewards. If they believe in God is not real, they are dead and no harm is done. However, if one does not believe in God and God is real, they are damned. And if they do not believe in God and God does not exist, it is a net zero return anyway. So he states, let us weigh the gain and the loss in wagering that God is. Let us estimate these two chances. If you gain all. If you lose nothing. Wager then, without hesitation, that he is. I can only think that this name was used in Bradherley as a sort of irony, right, considering the detestable circumstances that these girls have end up being subjected to and what they have to go through with zero volition of their own. If anybody on this planet was allowed to detest God or be pissed off at the powers above, it's these girls, right? But anyway, let's continue with the story. You've heard the old saying, lambs to the slaughter, right? Well, if so, you pretty well have an idea of what's coming next. The lambs are used as resources to satiate the sadistic and carnal urges of the prisoners in order to prevent more uprisings and quell the discontent with the wealthy and those who imprison them. And the situation is just as sad and sickening as it sounds. The first chapter of the manga is the most graphic, showcasing in some detail the absolute hell these girls are put through when they are sent to these prisons through the perspective of a single girl whom is taken from her village and told that she will be joining the troupe. It's hard to adequately describe the level of unease Hideaki is able to place in the reader, as even before the reality of what is happening is unveiled, he lets us know not everything is as it seems through the reactions of some of the orphanage staff members and the behaviors of the man driving the coach. And that's one of the most sickening parts of the whole ordeal, the number of people who know what these girls are being signed up for and still allow it to happen. But this ability to facilitate this very reaction is exactly the kind of misguided anger that I think takes Bradherley no Basha from a tragic but trashy shock manga into something much more artistic. There's a lot of clamor online, right, of people comparing Bradherley to a lot of other quote-unquote shock manga, right? Things that are gory or have edgy subject matter, basically just for the sake of it in order to elicit some sort of emotional reaction from the reader. But I want to go into what makes Bradherley more artistic and much more deliberate than so many of those other stories that can be found on the internet. See, the knee-jerk and visceral reaction to what is being shown on screen is to call the orphanage staff, the guards, the prisoners, etc., monsters, and I want to see them burned at the stake. And you know what? This reaction isn't wrong in the least. But what I feel makes Bradherley so good is how this situation sheds a beaming light on the absolutely disgusting systemic issues that have been allowed to persist both historically and present day, and how the very entities we set up for our protection and safety turn us into commodities to be used for its own whims and capitalistic gain. Before I jump into this topic though, I want to spend a moment exploring how the art in this manga works so well in creating the uniquely oppressive and tragic tone the story has going for it. Now, even those whom absolutely hate Bradherley no Basha have sung the praises of its art. The wispy lines and sketchy appearance, coupled with the immensely detailed environments and clothing, lend it an air of grounded realism, while at the same time feeling dreamy and ethereal. The weight of the realism is felt the heaviest in the graphic depictions of violence that occur against the lambs in the story. Easily the hardest parts of this narrative to get through are being subjected to the injuries and broken bodies of the lambs after the prisoners have had their way with them. Hiroaki does not shy away from showing swelling on the girls' faces, bruised rib cages, bite marks on the chest, removed nipples. It is absolutely brutal and hard to look at some points, but this is exactly the point of it as well. In an interview, Hiroaki explores his relationship to women in the female form, and it's much different than the average mangaka, I would say. Hiroaki talks about having discussion with other industry veterans and discussed how women are mostly used as vehicles for the author's fetishes in the writing. And I think that this is something that can be found in nearly every manga, right? Where so many of the female characters are used as strictly a means of motivation for the main character, or as like the fan service and sex appeal. And there's not a single thing wrong with this, right? Like, I'm not afraid of boobs. Like, that's not it at all. But they are treated with a certain lack of respect that's very evident to anybody watching or reading it, right? Hiroaki explores how this way of thinking is very unappealing to him. Hiroaki states that he does not get any sexual gratification from the typical fan service found in anime and manga. He states that his primary concern is the aesthetic beauty of women. The thing that influences him the most are exploring his appreciation for the aesthetic beauty of the feminine form through things like expressions and how a woman expresses herself in everyday situations. He explores how he feels he has never had a talent for drawing the typical big-boobed women found in manga, and I think that these preferences of Hiroaki are what make the violence and sexuality in the story so much more tastefully done than what can be found in other works of the same medium. Despite how graphic some of the images are, I never got the impression that I was supposed to be aroused or turned on by what was happening on the panel. Hiroaki's respect for the feminine form and the humanity of women very much comes across in the art, and the situations the lamb finds himself in have so much more gravity because of it. Now again, I don't think that there's a single thing wrong with sexuality and fan service, but sexuality as it is typically presented in anime and manga would very much have cheapened the reality of what the girls in the story are going through, and I think that the reason Bradherley is able to strike such a chord with audiences is due to the realistic and artistic nature of the violence being presented. This is a major reason I don't vibe with the descriptions of Bradherley as some cheap hentai manga. To me, it is so evident much more time and care went into the depictions of what is happening on the page in Bradherley than so many more stories with quote-unquote edgy subject matter. I just sincerely don't even consider them to be in the same league. Sexual gratification from the violence depicted against women on the page is very much not what Bradherley is going for, and folks miss the point if this is what they got from it. So this final point is what leads me to believe Bradherley is very different from so many other manga or anime that cover dark subject matter. This difference to me is its clear parallels with real world horrors that have occurred and very much are still ongoing, and how it sheds light on these issues through invoking disgust and frustration in the reader. Now, there are some edgelords out there who will say otherwise, but for the vast majority who would come across this manga, learning of the true fate of the lambs and witnessing the violence depicted will very likely, and should, elicit some significant form of emotional response for the reader. For some it may be sadness, others it could be anger, but whatever the emotion happens to be, it is difficult to not feel something after learning about the state-sanctioned evil that is being propagated by those in power within the world of Bradherley no Basha. And to many, this atrocity is so heinous that we'll feel as though it could only be concocted in a world of fiction. Unfortunately though, this is very much not the case. While I have not found any evidence directly stating that Hiroaki took inspiration from these events, the situation in Bradherley no Basha very much resembles the atrocities that occurred against girls and women in previous major conflicts. But specifically for our purposes, we'll be referencing World War II. So in World War II, the Japanese believed that their soldiers would be unable to perform to their greatest extent if they were sexually frustrated, so comfort stations were created. And in these stations were housed kidnapped Japanese nationals who were assaulted, to put it in YouTube-friendly terms, in order to satiate the needs of the soldiers so they could perform their wartime duties without frustration. I truly can't even really imagine how sickening of a situation this was. In some reports I've read, many women were forcibly addicted to opium so that they would pass away after a set amount of time, creating a horrific form of renewable demand for new girls, while also increasing exports that were often stolen or bought for extremely low prices from the Chinese. Now, this is not to only put blame on the Japanese, right? Horrific wartime atrocities against women can be found in so many other cultures. From the Vikings to the American soldiers in Vietnam, you can look at nearly any conflict and see just sickening things like this being propagated against the victims or the quote-unquote losers, right? But the main point being that the things shown in Bradherley no Basha as far as the violence against these girls go are very far from being too unrealistic to be found in the real world. And these facts to me are what make Bradherley different from the run-of-the-mill edgelord stories that can often be found in manga or really any medium. The unique atmosphere, the realism of the world building crafted, coupled with the respect Hiroaki has for women, which emanates from every female character in the story, and the historic parallels of the tragedies occurring in the narrative, all tie together to make for a memorable experience, to say the least, for those who have the stomach to handle the subject matter. Now, Bradherley certainly isn't a story for everyone, but it's a tale worth being told, nonetheless.